Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective podcast. My guest this week is Malcolm Harkins. So, Malcolm, if you want to say hi and give a little bit of background on yourself.
Hey, thanks, Tony. Happy to be here. Malcolm Harkins. I recently just joined an early stage cybersecurity company called Epiphany Systems as Chief Security and Trust Officer, and that was announced and the company launched going into Black Hat a few weeks ago. Prior to that, I did 16-month stint at an early stage web application security company in doing similar things, Chief Security and Trust Officer. Prior to that, I was Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cylance that was acquired by BlackBerry back a few years ago. Prior to that, my life was pretty simple. I spent 24 years at Intel, straight out of graduate school, first in business roles, and then I tripped my way into security almost 20 years ago, October-ish of 2001.
That's actually kind of funny because my background was general IT. Like I came in doing, I was like a one-man IT department at McCann Erickson Detroit for a while. Then I was the head of a three-man department at a .com startup again just in Detroit. But I was doing IT stuff, and then I joined EDS again my focus was Microsoft cluster server. I was going around to General Motors facilities and helping implement Microsoft cluster server on these mission critical, manufacturing systems. And I happened to, as I was doing that, EDS was offering to pay the bill for, training and certification. So I went ahead and got my MCSE. I don't even remember what that stands for. Microsoft Certified something. But that happened to be at the same time that General Motors had given EDS this contract, hired us for this gig to do security. And the team lead of that group reached out because he knew I didn't have a security background, but he wanted someone with a solid Windows background to be on the team to help them understand, what they were doing or whatever. And that's, I just was like, all right. And it was kind of, I wasn't unaware of security. Like, I dealt with the I love you virus when I was at stoneage.com. So it's not like security wasn't a thing at all, but it was still very early stage. I mean, so I'm talking about 2003, I got into security.
Yeah, for me, I'm was a finance guy, procurement guy, business operations, worked in a variety of different business roles. First started in Intel's IT organization in 1992, and then into other business units. And I actually was the finance analyst that supported the small InfoSec team in the early 90s because they were part of the group that I was supporting as a financial analyst. But after 9/11 happened and Code Red and NIMDA happened in the fall, summer of 2001, Andy Grove was still running Intel, just like his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. He was frankly beating the shit out of a bunch of corporate officers to deal with the availability risk issues physically and logically. And Intel's chief information officer at the time, who I had known from my business role days because I had supported him, when he was a director in the IT organization, called me up and asked me to run security and business continuity. And I'm like, Doug, love to help you. I don't know anything about security. He's like, that's fine. I got a bunch of security geeks who don't know anything about the business. They'll teach you and you'll teach them. And like I said, that was 20 years ago, and I've never left the space. It really became a fulfilling mission to try and manage and mitigate to the best of my abilities and the abilities of the people who I worked with to keep the organization out of harm's way. And then, over time that expanded at Intel till I oversaw the traditional InfoSec stuff, product security stuff, some other kind of ethics, public policy, all in that kind of technology risk space, whether it be the technology we used or the technology we created.
Well, let's start a conversation there based on. So you've been in IT, you've been in security for 20 years. as as have I in some way, shape, or form. I mean, I went from being in the trenches to being purely a writer to now being on the marketing side of security. But one thing that I like to get perspective from people who've been there to witness kind of the evolution and how things are. It's like, what are your thoughts on, like, how far have we come in 20 years? And sort of the, well, if we've been doing this for 20 years, why haven't we solved the problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So almost 20 years ago, so 6 months into the role, and I've codified it in my 2 books that I published on managing risk and information security. So 6 months into the role, the perspective the company had at that time was they'd give Malcolm money, budget, people, and he would go put controls in place. And then once we kind of invested at a higher level, we'd be able to dial it all back and the problem would be solved. That was an engineering culture's mindset. 6 months in, I drew a picture that I called the perfect storm of risk to simplify for Intel's executives and the CIO and a bunch of other things what I foresaw happening as I was learning from the security team and thinking out as I would have as a strategic financial planner, like I had grown up to be, about the cycles that were at the beginning stages of it, and how threats, exploited vulnerabilities affecting information assets. We know that side. My job was to put in place controls, but I drew this kind of hidden hand of cybersecurity that started with geopolitical nation states, because nation states, even ahead of the California breach bill, ahead of all the privacy stuff, Sarbanes-Oxley, other kind of legislative things that deal with potentially technology risk issues, I foresaw nation states increasing their legislative stuff that would touch technology, which would generate a business risk. But nation states are also threat actors and threat agents. So they're accelerating the threat actor and the vulnerability side. And then I foresaw the conflicts that arise that as I was putting more controls in place to get more assurance that Malcolm was Malcolm, his device was his device, what he was doing and where he was doing it was an appropriate thing to do, that I'd be gaining more behavior and identity information on users, which would then potentially run afoul to the privacy legislation that I started seeing. So I drew this picture that I called the perfect storm of risk. I saw this confluence of independent yet interdependent things brewing into a cyberstorm of information risk. And the other critical component to all of this is information assets don't stay static. They're constantly changing, they're updating. The innovation and the usage models and the form factors continue to grow. And Intel was at the heart of that creation, right? From silicon to computing and all of its different forms. And I'm like, look, this is a growing thing as IT continues its urban sprawl. And then that's going to fuel vulnerabilities. Just because you can't eliminate them, right? You can't eliminate risk. You can do a good job of mitigating them and preventing them as much as possible, and then reacting to them when they occur. But I drew this perfect storm of risk. Now my moral compass told me that my obligation was, one, to understand that Rubik's Cube of risk as it would grow and morph and evolve, and then bring to bear the right capabilities to lower risk and manage it for the company. And so my perspective is, unfortunately, I was right. And I think we've had this growing perfect storm of cybersecurity risk. Then the question becomes, why has that occurred? And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One, on the attacker side, we've made it too easy for them to attack, and obviously there's incentives to do it, because you can finger point and say, well, I didn't do anything, and cybercrime would evolve and all that stuff. So there's the threat actor side of it. But when you get back to the technology creation, technology management side of it, frankly, we've all done a crappy job of mitigating and managing those risks. technology companies and even non-tech companies that create technology have done so without adequate security development lifecycle and privacy by design. Hence, we've had growing vulnerabilities because people have done a sloppy job. And then on the internal management side for IT and InfoSec, we've done a crappy job of managing, hygiene and identities and stuff like that. And then the other aspect of the whole thing is the security industry's done a shitty job. In some cases, the security industry has continued to sell and promote the use of capabilities that don't sufficiently manage and mitigate the risk. Why? Because the security industry has a profit motivation to sell stuff. And in some cases, sell stuff that doesn't work. Because if they can make money on it, they'll sell it.
Well, so all of that, great answer. I was going to say, I ask that question, not every podcast, but I ask that question somewhat often, and it's a fairly loaded question because there's also like because I've had people ask it, so I've had people come to me and be like, all right, why do we still have all these vulnerabilities? There's all these, there's a breach in the headlines every single day. There's a ransomware attack every single day. Like, what are you doing if you've been doing this for 20 years and all this stuff is still happening? And I'm like, all right, well, if I was dealing with a static world, I would accept your argument. If it was the exact same technology and the exact same threats as 20 years ago, then yes, it would be inexcusable for me to not have figured out how to solve that. But it's not. It's constantly evolving and as you pointed out, constantly growing. IoT wasn't a thing 20 years ago. Now there's billions of devices out there. Just the expansion of the volume of devices and users who are on the internet today as opposed to 20 years ago. And, social media didn't exist 20 years ago. So a lot changed and it continues to change. And as you pointed out, on the one hand, a lot of organizations and a lot of companies do a really bad job of thinking about security at all and developing it into the product in the first place, especially when it comes to IoT.
Yep.
But even when they do, even if a company does it right, it's not going to be perfect. There will still be vulnerabilities. And so, as long as we keep making new technologies, there's going to be a new frontiers, and the attackers, for the most part, are fairly creative and innovative. At least some of them. I mean, some of them, barely know what they're doing, and they're just, they're hiring ransomware as a service to get the job done. But the ones who are actively finding new ways, they're basically just as Intel or Cylance or Microsoft or whoever have to look at the market landscape and figure out how to evolve and adapt to stay at the front of that market landscape. The attackers are running a business the same way. And the attackers are running a business where they say, oh, Cylance is now doing this, this, and this. How do I get around that? What's my attack vector to bypass that protection? And so it's a constant cat and mouse game. And while I understand the frustration of some people to say, well, why do we have to deal with this? Why is this still such a big problem? All the things you pointed out, I think are true. Like if we could handle some of that, building security in better, handling the identity and access management better, all of those things, it would vastly improve it. But it's never going to go away, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. It's a journey with no finish line. But when I have that discussion come up, again, the simple fact of the matter, physically, logically, heck, even in financial markets, you can't eliminate risk, right? Even holding cash, I still face risk of inflation, right? Right. So every way in aspects of life, you can't eliminate risk. There was a lady that I spent time with, Glenys Breckwell, who wrote a book on the psychology of risk that I'd talked with her when I was working on my first book. And there was an aspect of her book that I thought was really salient. And it was written around physical risk, but I think the same attributes apply in the logical sense. Risk surrounds and envelops us. Without understanding it, we risk everything. Without capitalizing on it, we gain nothing. Right? A business is in place to take risks in order to make money, right? A business has a lot of externalities that it can't control: financial market, pandemic, a bunch of things, employment, physical events, a storm, a flood, an earthquake that can disrupt supply lines. But a good business manages and mitigates those risks so that regardless of externalities and things that are uncontrollable in the environment, they still survive and thrive and make profit. The thing that we've not done on the cybersecurity side is hold ourselves to the same level of accountability to deliver business outcomes, ones that are on a certain level of risk, ones that are on total cost of controls, and ones that are on, and some people disagree with me, but the controls that we have today, by and large, in most organizations, impede business velocity. They create friction and disrupt the user experience. They slow time to market. And I call that control friction. And in a high control friction environment, what happens? The business and the user go around the controls. So there's three outcomes that a CISO needs to be held accountable to by their board, their organization. An outcome on risk, an outcome on total cost, and an outcome on control friction. And until we start measuring and holding ourselves accountable to real outcomes, recognizing, just like in a business sense, you can forecast a revenue and a gross margin and sometimes not hit it for sometimes valid reasons. But over time, if you don't hit your P&L goals of cash and revenue and gross margin and net income, you get fired. Why? Because you didn't achieve the business result. If we start doing that, and then CIOs and CISOs start holding their security vendors accountable for what? Enabling to hit those outcomes and punishing them when they don't. Don't buy crap from people who have sold you stuff for a few years that didn't work, right? There's a bunch of things that we can do if we look at this as an economics problem and start addressing it differently. And then the other thing that you mentioned about the vulnerabilities, well, I agree. You can't eliminate being vulnerable, but I also believe that the hyper focus we've had on vulnerability management, on the one hand, while good, on the other hand, is distracting. There's a difference between being vulnerable and being exploitable from a component that's vulnerable to an exploitable path that creates the catastrophic material and significant event. Those two things are different. The entrance and the initial compromise might be the vulnerability, but the problem is we're not looking at the exploitable paths between that point of compromise that may be vulnerable, that we might never be able to fully mitigate holistically through the daisy chain of all those steps and paths and connections and identities and all that stuff, to something that creates the oh shit moment. Right. And I think, again, if we start saying we have to do vulnerability management and all that hygiene stuff, but we've got to look at the attack paths we have in our environment, find out where that pivot point of exploitability is, and take action on that. If we do that, we'll be able to demonstrate a real risk reduction and better prioritize our focus, which will lower our costs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I give, from my perspective, the first time I heard this sort of angle on it was from George Kurtz when he was at McAfee. But I had a conversation with him, and we were talking about like Microsoft Patch Tuesday vulnerabilities, and he was the one who enlightened me to say, well, okay, Microsoft comes out with the thing and they say, well, this is a critical vulnerability. And that's helpful for you to understand, okay, well, what does this mean kind of in an abstract? But you have to have the context of your environment. You have to, like maybe it's not critical to you. You have to figure out, well, what systems is it on? What other mitigating controls do you have in place? Is it even public facing? And prioritize accordingly. You can't just take Microsoft's word for it and say, okay, well, they said it's critical, so that's our top priority.
No, you're totally right. But the other challenge we've got is we also can't necessarily rely on on the individuals in our company, because it's a highly manual effort. Microsoft says this, the press says that. You pull a team together and they argue on their differing perspectives, and we all have a bias, right? The data we pull from a particular system is biased. The perspective that an individual that's worried about one aspect of security is going to have that bent and create a bias. So you know, and if you look at that, those biases create a misperception of the real risks. And if you look at the misperception of a risk as a vulnerability, how do you mitigate it? Diversity of perspective, which is why we need to have better instrumentation across our environments. So in an automated, effective, and efficient fashion, we can understand what the attacker's goal would be, and we can and understand the attack paths that exist, so that we can actually then go look at that quote unquote vulnerability relative to the exploitable path to the significant event. And you hit it right on the head. The context matters, and missing context means that we're going to have an elusiveness to the truth of what's occurring or what could occur, and what actions that we can actually do to manage and mitigate those risks. And then go, okay, broadly, then time to context is also critically important, because the faster we can get that context and know where we need to take action. In some cases, it might not be to patch the system. It might be to take 2 or 3 other actions in the infrastructure that breaks the attack path, that leads from a point of compromise to, you know, the catastrophic event.
Right. Which is a good segue, because the other thing I wanted to touch on was you had alluded to, you know, security vendors will continue to sell you tools that might not be the right tools because they have a vested interest in generating revenue, which is true for any company. And the thing is, I've witnessed it firsthand, because I've been at, you know, cybersecurity companies where even as they have developed themselves better, newer, like more cutting edge solutions, and they want to roll those out, there's always this internal struggle with sales where they're like, yeah, but you know, we're still churning renewals on our endpoint protection product, you know, and we're over here going, okay, but you know, we've now we're doing, you know, MDR or whatever, we're going bigger than that, and they're like, yeah, but we need to keep selling this. And from the CIO, CISO perspective, I'm reminded of, there's a story I had heard back when I was in sales and listening to Zig Ziglar, where he talked about you know, the young couple, and the wife's making a ham and she cuts the ends off the ham, and the husband says, well, why are you cutting the ends off the ham? She's like, I don't know, my mother always did that, that's just how you make a ham. And he said, I don't think so. So they called the mom. They said, well, why do you cut the ends off the ham? And she said, well, my mom did it. That's just the way it's done. That's the way you make a ham. So they called the grandmother and they said, well, why did you cut the ends off the ham? She said, well, our oven was only so big, we had to cut the ends off the ham in order to make it fit. And, you know, so that whole story is just saying, look, you're just doing what was previously done because it was previously done. And you're not actually stopping to think about, okay, is that still the right thing to do? And I feel like that applies to a lot of the legacy tools, like the things that I was deploying when I was in the trenches in 2003, 4, 5, 6, of just antivirus on the endpoints, and you know, got to my firewall, I've got a spam filter, you know, maybe some intrusion detection, intrusion prevention type tools running, and it's like, you know, those things served a purpose then, but they don't really fit now, at least not without something to tie them together, something to weave them all together, because you need the bigger picture. And I feel like each one of those tools, and I've used this recently, is the hammer and nail analogy. You know, it's like your antivirus software only knows how to see viruses. Everything is a virus, or it's not a threat. And each tool kind of has its own biased perspective. And so you need you need an overarching tool that can see and connect the dots and say, okay, yes, but if you take this and this and this, and then we can see the whole attack chain and tie it back to here, and so it's like a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, we need to figure out how to get corporations, how to break the cycle of just renewing antivirus endpoint protection because that's what you've always done.
Yeah, well, and there's a whole mess of categories. There's, and again, legacy tools, legacy perspectives, and then to some extent, I experienced this at Silence as well. Compliance regimes, in many cases, also perpetuate a dated architecture, a dated approach to controls. Right? I've seen it multiple times. It's, how often do you update your data and definition files? I'm like, that is an insufficient, flawed control. Signatures, yeah, you can show that they block some things, but you have to have somebody's had to experience pain and an issue before you can write a signature. And there's so many different ways around it. You look at things like DLP. DLP is also a flawed control. Doesn't work. It doesn't prevent data loss from a malicious insider, and it doesn't prevent data loss from an external threat actor and threat agent. Why? Because it's signature based, and they can get around it. If they got into your systems, they can steal the technology regardless of a DLP. The only thing that's good for is keeping a non-malicious user from making a mistake in handling of the data. So we have all of these approaches that are just flawed in their architecture, flawed in their ability to control for risk. It's also why, since I left Intel, I've spent more time with innovative security companies. Why? Because, again, the entrenched big players, they have a profit motive. And if they can sell for a decent margin something that works and keep you hooked on it, they don't have an incentive to, only do incrementalism to the control. And again, computing's been growing exponentially for decades, right? And what does that mean? That means the attack surface has been growing exponentially. What did we see, as you were mentioning in the news? We see exponential growth in the exploitation of issues. And we've been approaching our controls linearly with a lot of incrementalism. And that's also creating this risk gap, that I've seen and experienced, and I've been trying to address in the programs that I've run, but also in the companies that I've joined and the companies that I advise that are really trying to transform, an approach to control in a way that delivers a real business outcome for folks.
Okay. I'm going to shift a little bit, but it kind of ties back to where you started. You when you were talking about your time at Intel and things like that, and the perspective on the increasing risk of nation states. And so now you look at where we are now. We're in this sort of cyber cold war with Russia and China, or at least Russia and Chinese based attackers, and then we can have a whole debate about how connected they are actually with the government. But that's going on, and so nation state attacks are a bigger deal. And it's been obviously a huge topic of conversation this year, because we had the dark side attack against Colonial Pipeline, we had the Revel attack against JBS Meatpacking, both of them based out of Russia. We've had the Hafnium attacks that were exploiting the Microsoft Exchange server vulnerabilities out of China, and so when Biden went and met with the G7 or whatever, that was a primary topic of conversation, was how do we deal with this? What is our response? And like you and I were talking about a little bit before we started, but right now today, Biden has called a meeting with a bunch of tech CEOs. There's infrastructure CEOs because there's some oil and gas in there. There's some like municipal water treatment people in there or something. I mean, it's a pretty big cross section, and they're there to ostensibly discuss these issues, these challenges, and figure out, okay, well, what is that? What do we do as a cybersecurity industry, and what is the public-private partnership in this? How do we make that work? But then the broader question becomes, can we make that work? Because, like you had mentioned before we started recording, going way back to Bush Jr., when he, made Richard Clark his cybersecurity czar, they've had the role, but it's similar to, oftentimes it seems similar to the way many companies treat the CISO, which is, I'm going to hire this person to be kind of a figurehead and not really give them the latitude or the budget to actually do the job I'm tasking him to do. But then I'm going to hold them responsible as the scapegoat when things go wrong. And I remember there being like a series of people resigning from this role, at the federal level, because they're like, okay, well, you hired me to do a job, but you won't let me do the job. So the question becomes, okay, so you have all these CEOs, they go sit down with Biden, they come up with a plan, but then what? Who has the actual authority and budget to make the plan happen?
Yeah, again, as we were chatting a little bit before we started this, and I'll again share my perspective on it. I'd say by and large, for the past few decades, the cybersecurity agenda at that kind of public policy level and the various administrations over the past couple decades hasn't shifted that dramatically. Some of the core tenets of what Richard Clark and the Bush administration had started doing in 2001, 2002, by and large, there's just been Delta things to it. I'm supportive of the Biden administration approach. I think, the people they have put in key roles, Chris Inglis, former deputy director of the NSA, and who has been at the NSA as well and was put in place, to help do some look at things post SolarWinds. Very, very smart people, really know what they're doing, have an action-oriented approach. But getting back to this meeting, today with a variety of companies, I think it's good that those meetings occur. The question is, what's the outcome of it? At this point, in a little bit of a jaded perspective, I've seen these type of meetings before. I've helped prep executives to attend them, and in some cases, I've been in the gallery in some of those things, or the side meetings that happened before and afterwards. And by and large, not much changes. So, you got to look at it and go, is it useful to get people on the same page and talking? Yes. But most of those organizations are prepped by their public policy team. They're prepped for their own motivations as to what they want to see happen or not happen to protect their profits, minimize their liabilities. And, by and large, they have that perspective coming in, as they should as corporations. And so unless something substantial comes out of it, like a new executive order that actually moves the needle, and I've been supportive of the ones that have come out recently of the Biden administration, or we start taking real legislative action on things that make a difference, like holding companies who create technology accountable to having proper controls to minimize vulnerabilities in technology. Also have legislative action to hold organizations who operate technology accountable for the integrity of those systems. Again, you can't eliminate risk, but people are fundamentally failing to do the right things the right way. It drove me nuts when the Colonial Pipeline CEO said in their testimony that ransomware occurred because of an exposed password and the lack of MFA. I go, in what world does that one thing create that type of catastrophic event? That's ridiculous. Right. So we've got to stop making these simple statements that confuse the reality of what occurred. That may have been the initial point of compromise, but there was an attack path within the company that was exploitable that led to that issue. So let's go stop focusing on the simple aspects of vulnerability, and let's go do the hard work of what we should have been doing for the past couple decades. Where are we exploitable? And what actions can we take to minimize that exploitability to prevent the material and significant events that are causing harm to our organizations, harm to our customers, and societal harm?
Yeah, one of the things I always find humorous / frustrating is, anytime there's an attack, when it makes headlines, there's a default knee-jerk public relations response before they even know, like they haven't even done the investigation. They don't actually know what was attacked or how it happened, but they've already issued a statement saying that it was a sophisticated, advanced, persistent threat from a nation-state attacker. And
perfect way to deflect liability.
It sounds impressive, but in the end, my philosophy is more like, okay, but you still have to defend against that. Like, okay, that's the world we live in. You will face sophisticated attacks. You will face advanced, persistent threats. You will face nation-state attacks. So defend against them. That's not an excuse. That's not an excuse to get compromised.
In most of those quote unquote sophisticated attacks, the initial entrance point was not that sophisticated.
Right. They very rarely.
Sophistication was the speed with which they moved through the attack path and the exploitable pivot points in your company. That's where the sophistication comes through. In many cases, and like I said, it drives me nuts to hear all that stuff, because I would prefer us, or the people we get enamored. Well, was it Russia? Was it China? I'm like, look, the threat actor is not a controllable variable for me as a chief information security officer, chief security officer. I can't control the threat actor and threat agent. The only thing I can control is aspects of vulnerability and where there's those pivot points of exploitability. Those are the only things I can control. And by focusing on who done it, yeah, that's interesting, and it catches a lot of press and all that stuff. But I go, that's again, the nation state, law enforcement, intelligence agencies to focus on that. My job is to manage the risk, and the only way in which I can manage the risk is by having the appropriate controls in place to manage to some level of vulnerability and have the appropriate understanding of where I'm exploitable from something that's meaningless, a random endpoint, to the catastrophic material event that would harm my organization and my customers, or perhaps society. That is my job.
Right. And so to bring this back to this this Biden conference today, this meeting, I do think in, say, the last 5 years ish, that the landscape has changed. I feel like when Sony got hit, and we attributed it to North Korea, but it was still sort of like, that's Sony's problem. Like there was a distinct separation from what the NSA was doing and how the government protects itself, and then private organizations. And I feel like there wasn't as much cooperation, or the federal government didn't feel any responsibility to sort of safeguard or help out private organizations. And now the way attacks are happening, because I've also talked with many companies, or the smaller companies, who are like, oh, I'm not worried about that. Like I'm not Lockheed Martin, I'm not Raytheon, I'm not the Pentagon. I'm not worried about nation state attacks. And I'm like, okay, but that's not really the way the attacks work in a lot of cases. Like they're looking for any attack vector, and you as Joe Blow company might be the way in, because if you've got a trusted relationship with Home Depot, and Home Depot has a trusted relationship with the Pentagon for some reason, they can get there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I on the one hand, there are some aspects of the landscape that have changed, and some of that's the explosion of technology and the usage models occurring. But what you just said actually isn't a landscape change. It's actually the fact that people were misperceiving the risk. This game was already afoot. And people, getting back to my initial comments of the misperception of risk, people were misperceiving the risk issues, and so therefore didn't properly plan and prepare for them. And that's not a landscape shift. That's people weren't doing their job. Our job is to contemplate risk, right? And think about ways to manage it and mitigate it. Just like I've said very bluntly to folks who said, who could have thought a pandemic would occur? Well, let's see. That was a known certainty that it would occur at some periodic level. I was working on Intel's pandemic response in 2002. Shame on you if you didn't contemplate that that would occur again at some point. And shame on you if you didn't have the proper mitigation in place to manage through it. Our job as risk managers, we fail when we are not future casting the thing that could bite us in the ass and then doing what we can to manage and mitigate those risks. It's not that you can eliminate it, and you might not even be able to prevent it. But if you haven't at least contemplated it, you're going to be flat-footed when it comes to detecting and responding to it.
Okay, that's fair. But what are your thoughts on trying to think of a situation? I mean, even JBS, meatpacking. I mean, like, it's not. On the one hand, I mean, there's a debate to be made. I wouldn't think of it offhand as critical infrastructure, but there's an argument to be had of, well, you're disrupting the supply of food. That was a significant source of food. But it's
it's funny that you mentioned it. So an example that I've used in a lot of public speeches for a decade is an attack on the food and beverage industry. Because again, over a decade ago, I was having dialogue with peers when I was at Intel on how to have a conversation with your board on risk, and there was 10 or 12 people around, none of them for the tech industry, some financial sector, some consumer and retail and stuff. There's a couple of food and beverage, and one of the peers, and I won't name them, is like, Malcolm, you got it easy. You're in the tech industry, they understand this stuff. My CEO and board doesn't care about cyber risk. And, again, while I was still at Intel, it may not have been 10 years ago, 7 years ago, but still cyber risk was on a pretty brisk pace still back then. And I'm like, well, that's a problem with you, not a problem with your board. So we end up in a bit of an argument. And I knew all these folks, and I'm like, look, let's just pause the discussion for a moment. What could cause an extinction event for your business? What is such a substantial risk issue? Ignore cyber. What's a substantial risk issue that you would have to spend $1 billion in 10 years to recover the brand, or you're potentially going out of business? They're like, well, that's easy. Is the lettuce tainted with E. coli, or is the hamburger meat? I said, okay, food safety, food and beverage industry, #1 business risk. Yes. Okay, great. I said, what's your problem having a cyber discussion with your board? And you're like, what do you mean? And I went to a board and I drew a supply chain. I said, do you own the slaughterhouse? No. Okay, so freight on board from there to point of sale. Like, yes. I said, how do you know that the food is safe? Cow has an RFID tag on its ear. It's got dates and times of antibiotics, feed, birth date, all that stuff. It gets slaughtered. Half a cow gets wrapped probably in plastic, stuck in a box, RFID tag, barcode, flows through there into a truck that has a refrigeration unit, industrial control system, GPS tracker in the truck. It's like it goes into the store, and I walked through the whole thing. I was like, how do you know your food is safe? So the only way in which you know your food is safe is the flow of information from the slaughterhouse to the point of sale. Go back to the risk equation. Risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, but more importantly, exploitability and consequence. I said, do we think there's an animal rights whack job activist out there that would want to save 10,000 cows tomorrow? Everybody raises their hand. I said, so threat is certain. So we know consequence, somebody could die. What's your cybersecurity program for your food safety data? Person looked at me and they had no flipping idea. Shame on you. I've been using that example for years. And I've never worked in the food and beverage industry. I just look at it and I go, what is the preeminent risk? Once you start thinking about that, then you can start creating the direct and indirect cyber-related events that could contribute to that. That's how, as a finance guy, I started tying the aspects of enterprise risk that Intel had and how cyber would directly or indirectly contribute to it. And what I saw from 2002, at that time, the enterprise risk map, I'll be directionally correct, had 10 items on it. And there's maybe 3 that had direct or indirect cybersecurity related stuff. My last year at Intel, that enterprise risk map had 16 items on it. And guess what? 12 or 13 of them had cyber related direct or indirect contributions to those enterprise risks. I go, that's a failure of the people who've been managing information risk to do their jobs.
Right. So 2 things. Number one, I was going to say it is actually fairly impressive to me as a consumer that when they do find, hey, we detected there's E. coli in this lettuce, that they are able to say, okay, but that lettuce came from that farm, and the lettuce from that farm went to these distributors, and so they're able to like pinpoint, which lettuce to pull off the market.
But imagine an integrity attack, and I shut off the refrigeration unit in the truck as it's driving, and then send false information that it's actually cold, let it spoil and go bad, and then I turn it back on before it gets there, and then people eat it and get sick. Right. Or I manipulate the data, right? So you could do an integrity attack across that supply chain of food safety data and kill people.
Right. Well, and so the other thing I was going to say is using that analogy sort of, and for other companies to consider the broader risk, you look at what happened with SolarWinds and with Kaseya, and I think a lot of companies were caught flat-footed. It just didn't really occur to them to think that, oh, the tools that I'm just using, that I'm just downloading updates and have access to all of my servers, might be compromised.
No, you're exactly right. I was on a variety of calls with a bunch of peers when SolarWinds broke. Well, I think it was on a Friday, and I was in calls with them a little bit over the weekend, but Monday and Tuesday. And I was, again, I'm harsh on people in our role. A lot of people did a lot of good things, and I know I'm over-characterizing this, but I frankly was appalled by some organizations who didn't even know if they had SolarWinds in their environment. And then I was further appalled by a few peers who said that previous to that, SolarWinds was considered a low-risk capability. I'm like, in what world is a systems management tool that's privileged access to your infrastructure potentially low risk? I mean, that makes no sense.
Yeah. Well, and on a semi-related note, there was the story that broke last week or whatever about BlackBerry divulging, the flaws in the QNX system, and they actually said, according to the statement to the federal government, we don't actually know where this product is in use. Like, we sell it to OEMs sell it to other people. We're not tracking it. We can't tell you where this software is.
Well, that I actually totally understand, having come from the tech side and stuff like that. And again, I'll go back to a privacy related item. It was, I think, 2005-ish that Intel had a privacy issue related to processor serial numbers, because we were wanting to put that in place so that we had that traceability for valid reasons to help OEMs and customers do better asset management and stuff like that. And it created a massive privacy kerfuffle that Intel was able to understand where all of its processors were. So I get how, particularly even more so in a distributed supply chain and on the software side, particularly once you sell it, you don't know exactly where it's in use. I mean, it just like, and again, I don't think it was anything complicit or negative. You go back during, the early days of the Afghan and Iraq wars, there was processors used in IEDs, improvised explosive devices, from various manufacturers. Why? Because somebody could go get an old 15-year-old PC that was bought on a recycle thing that went through here and there and everything else, and somebody popped the processor and a few things and cobbled it together into a physical device that would create harm. You can't necessarily control, once you sell things, the full extent of where it's used and how it's used.
Right. Actually, I need to put that in context on BlackBerry's behalf too, because I believe it was in relation to them initially saying they did not want to publicly disclose. They wanted to just reach out privately to the affected party, basically just send out memos to customers to say, hey, look, there's this issue with QNX, you should update. But then had to come back and go, actually, we can't do that because we have no idea. Like, all we can do is, we can only send memos to the companies that bought from us, but we don't know what happened after that. And I think that was part of the decision for announcing publicly, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I read a few of the articles. It's again, vulnerability disclosure is a careful mixture of art and science and ethical responsibility. And when you do it, how you do it, who you do it to, what the timing of that stuff is. In some cases where it's technology that's used in sensitive areas like critical infrastructure or the defense, or the government and military, there's also special things that you need to do to manage that, because if you went too big, too fast, too public, you might actually create more harm. And right. So there's like I said, having had responsibility for that stuff, it's a mixture of art, science, and ethical and moral responsibilities that people need to navigate in terms of how they approach that to do it the right way, to protect everybody to the greatest extent possible.
Right, because I know from the stories that they said that QNX is also it's in use in some way, shape, or form on the International Space Station, and it's like, all right, well, you don't want to announce, you need to have your patch ready, you need to have your patch deployed before you publicly announce that QNX is vulnerable on the space station.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case, but yeah, exactly. That's the calculus that you need to do to really figure out the appropriate way to walk a path. Because if you don't do that, you might actually be creating more substantial and/or acute harm. But it's just the nature of the beast of managing these things.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to kind of wind things down, but let me just give you a chance to, is there a question you wish I would have asked, or any parting thoughts, or if you want to put a plug in for Epiphany?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think you asked a lot of questions, and I think we covered most of the things. As I mentioned before, I spend and have spent my time since Intel joining companies that I believe technically can make a difference in terms of how we're approaching controls. Epiphany is no different than that, and I'm as excited to have joined Epiphany as I was when I joined Silence. I think the opportunity to redefine how we're approaching certain aspects of controls or environment and transform our approach to risk management is substantial. So if you have any interest, check us out at epiphanysystems.com, or ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and happy to have a chat on it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining me. Take care.
Hey, thanks, Tony.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.